Something is happening to us. Cancer rates are rising, depression is climbing, anxiety feels almost normal now. And while we search for complex explanations, one of the biggest causes is painfully simple. We stopped moving. Physical inactivity has quietly become one of the most dangerous patterns of modern life. Here's what's shocking. Women who get just 150 minutes of physical activity per week, barely over 20 minutes a day, reduce their risk of breast cancer by 30 to 50%. That's not a minor improvement. That's life-changing. And yet, only about 3% of our medical budget goes toward prevention. 3%. Meanwhile, roughly 75% of the diseases we spend billions treating are largely preventable. Think about that for a second. We've built a system that waits for breakdown, instead of protecting the body before it collapses. And the deeper you go into the science of exercise, the clearer something becomes. Strength training isn't optional, especially as you age. The more we study muscle loss over time, the more alarming it looks. When people retire, they often move less. Less movement leads to muscle loss. Muscle loss leads to weakness. Weakness leads to even less movement. And just like that, a quiet downward spiral begins. Retirement itself is a very modern Western idea. For most of human history, humans didn't suddenly stop being physically useful at a certain age. We were built to stay active. So when we don't, we pay for it. But here's the real challenge. Most people don't hate exercise because they're lazy. From an evolutionary perspective, conserving energy made sense. Our ancestors moved when survival demanded it, not for aesthetics, not for step counts. So the question isn't, why don't we feel like exercising? The real question is, how do we redesign our lives so movement becomes natural again? And then there are the myths. There are so many that you need to suffer for exercise to work. That cardio is all that matters. That lifting weights is only for the young. That if you haven't started by now, it's too late. These beliefs quietly keep people sedentary. But the human body has always been designed for motion. When we stop moving, nothing dramatic happens at first. It's subtle, a little less strength, a little less energy, a little more fragility. Until one day, decline feels normal, and that's the real danger. Most of what we think we know about health comes from a very small slice of humanity. Nearly 90% of medical data comes from people in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. That's a narrow window. If you truly want to understand how the human body evolved, how it was designed to function, you can't only study people living modern, industrialized lives. You have to leave places like Boston. You have to go to Africa, to Mexico, to communities living very differently. Because in those places, you can observe something rare. You can watch populations transitioning, moving from traditional lifestyles to modern ones. And in that transition, you begin to see what changes, what breaks down, what adapts, what doesn't. Because if you want to understand modern disease, sometimes you have to step outside the modern world. After years of research, after all the data, after studying evolution, disease, and physical activity across cultures, something shifted. Not gradually, but in a single moment, an epiphany. It happened in Mexico. There, data was being collected on the Tarahumara, a community widely known for extraordinary long-distance running. Among them was an older man, in his 70s. Still running long distances, still respected for it. A simple question was asked, "How do you train?" It seemed straightforward, but the translator hesitated. She struggled not because the sentence was complicated, but because the concept itself didn't exist. There was no word for training in their language, no cultural equivalent. The idea of running in order to prepare for running simply wasn't there. As the question was explained, the response became clear even through tone alone. Why would anyone run if they didn't have to? And in that moment, everything made sense. Of course, exercise as we understand it is unusual. If you are a farmer working long hours in the fields without machines, if you are a hunter-gatherer walking 5 to 10 miles a day, digging, carrying, throwing, working just to secure enough food, why would you wake up and go for an unnecessary 5-mile run? Why spend energy you don't need to spend? From an evolutionary perspective, it makes no sense. And that realization changes how you see modern exercise. We treat it as discipline, as an obligation, as a virtue. But for most of human history, movement was not separate from life. You didn't train. You simply lived. And maybe the issue isn't laziness. Maybe the issue is that we are asking our instincts to accept something completely new, to move, without necessity. There's one topic that always draws attention, one question that consistently rises to the top. Exercise myths, the way we think about movement, the way we've been told to move, the rules we rarely question. Earlier, there was a realization in Mexico that structured training is not something most traditional cultures even recognize. Going to a gym, running for no reason, exercising as a separate activity, these are not ancient behaviors. They are products of comfort, of modern privilege. When you don't have to hunt for food, when you don't have to farm all day, movement becomes optional. And when something becomes optional, it becomes something we have to convince ourselves to do. But that's only the beginning. To truly understand exercise, you also have to understand inactivity. And this is where some of the biggest myths appear. For example, the idea that everyone needs exactly 8 hours of sleep, or the popular slogan that sitting is the new smoking. These messages are repeated constantly. Sleep more, sit less. But when you examine them carefully, something feels off. Take sitting. We're told it's dangerous, that every hour in a chair is shaving time off your life. But step back for a moment. All animals sit. Dogs sit. Cows sit. Chickens sit. Hunter-gatherers sit. In fact, when activity sensors were placed on traditional populations, the data showed something surprising. They sit roughly as much as people in modern Western societies, so sitting itself is not the villain. The real difference isn't how much we sit, it's how we sit. In industrialized societies, people often sit for long, uninterrupted stretches, 40 minutes at a time, sometimes much longer. In more traditional environments, people tend to stand up every 10 to 15 minutes. They interrupt the sitting, and that small interruption changes everything. Standing up briefly, even without intense activity, activates the body. Blood sugar levels shift. Cellular processes turn on. Certain genes become active. It's like starting the engine of a car. You don't need to drive around the block. You just need to turn it on. The solution isn't extreme. It's simple. Stand up occasionally. Walk to the kitchen. Make tea. Step outside. Pet the dog. On long flights, choosing the aisle seat suddenly makes sense. Not because sitting is deadly, but because uninterrupted stillness is unnatural. And sometimes the biggest myths persist because they sound dramatic. But the truth is usually more nuanced, less extreme, and more practical. And then there's sleep, another area filled with strong opinions. For decades, we've been told the same rule: 8 hours. Anything less is a problem. Anything less means something is wrong. That belief has been around since the Industrial Revolution. Around the time modern work schedules began reshaping daily life, we're often told that technology destroys our sleep: electric lights, television, smartphones. There's even a popular idea that the invention of the light bulb ruined humanity's natural rhythm. But when researchers study populations without electricity, no TVs, no phones, no artificial lighting, something surprising appears. They don't sleep for 8 hours. On average, they sleep 6 to 7 hours per night, and they don't regularly nap during the day, which challenges the assumption that natural human sleep equals 8 hours. It simply doesn't. When you look at large-scale health data, another pattern emerges. If you graph sleep duration on one axis and outcomes like cardiovascular disease or mortality on the other, you don't get a straight line. You get a U-shaped curve. Too little sleep increases risk. But so does too much. And the lowest point of that curve, the optimal zone, tends to sit around 7 hours. Not 8, 7. Which means, statistically, many people do better at 7 hours than at 8. Yet culturally, we've been conditioned to believe that 8 is the gold standard. Anything less feels like failure. Of course, sleep is complex. People who are ill may sleep more. Age matters. Teenagers often need more. Older adults often need less. There's variation. But the larger point remains. The human body is not governed by a single rigid number. And sometimes, the rules we repeat most confidently are the ones that deserve closer examination. Another popular idea in modern culture is the 10,000-step rule. It sounds scientific, precise, authoritative. Walk 10,000 steps a day. That's the target. But the origin of that number is surprisingly simple. It wasn't born from decades of medical research. It started in Japan. In the 1960s, just before the Tokyo Olympics, a company introduced a pedometer. During a meeting to name the device, the number 10,000 was chosen, not because of data, not because of clinical trials, but because it sounded good. It was a round number, an auspicious number, easy to remember. And just like that, a cultural standard was born. Interestingly, when researchers later examined step counts and health outcomes, the number wasn't entirely unreasonable. Hunter-gatherer populations often walk between 10,000 and 18,000 steps per day, depending on factors like sex and daily tasks. But when you look at large epidemiological studies in modern populations, something subtle appears. If you graph daily steps against health outcomes, the curve tends to level off around 7,000 to 8,000 steps. That's where the major benefits seem to stabilize. Beyond that, additional steps still contribute, but the gains are smaller. So 10,000 steps isn't a magical number. It's not a biological threshold. It's more of a reasonable target, a useful guideline, not a law of nature. And like many things in health science, the truth is less dramatic than the slogan. There isn't a perfect number. There is simply a range. And consistency matters more than precision. After studying exercise for years, after traveling across cultures, after analyzing how different populations move, age, and adapt, a personal question naturally emerges. What changes? Strength training. Walking has always been enjoyable. Running felt natural. Endurance activities were easy to commit to. But lifting weights? That was different. Uncomfortable. Unpleasant. Easy to avoid. And like most people, it's tempting to do what feels good and quietly ignore what doesn't. But the deeper the research went, the clearer the pattern became. Muscle matters. Especially with age. Loss of muscle mass isn't cosmetic. It's functional. There's even a clinical term for it, sarcopenia. It simply means muscle loss, and it happens gradually. As people get older, muscle mass declines. With less muscle comes frailty. With frailty comes reduced capacity. Everyday tasks become harder, and once that decline begins, it feeds itself. Less strength leads to less movement. Less movement accelerates muscle loss, and the cycle tightens. It's not dramatic at first, it's subtle. But over time, it becomes deeply limiting. Which is why resistance training becomes more important, not less, as the years pass. So now, strength workouts are taken seriously, at least 2 sessions each week, not because they're enjoyable, but because they're necessary, because aging is inevitable. Frailty doesn't have to be. And sometimes, the most meaningful change isn't discovering something new. It's finally acting on what you already know. It's tempting to think of it this way. If you stop lifting weights as you age, you accelerate aging itself. But that framing isn't quite right. Age is simply time passing. The clock moves forward whether we like it or not. There is no stopping that. What changes is not age, it's how the body responds to it. There's a difference between growing older and biological decline, and this is where physical activity becomes powerful. Perhaps the most important function of exercise is not building muscle. It's slowing the rate at which certain systems deteriorate. Endurance activities, walking, running, swimming, influence the heart, lungs, metabolism. Strength training affects muscle mass, bone density, and functional capacity. They work differently. But together, they influence what we casually call aging. And here is where one of the biggest myths appears. The idea that becoming less active as you grow older is normal. It isn't. Humans evolved to live long past their reproductive years. In fact, one of the most unusual aspects of our species is that we often live decades after we stop having children. Very few animals do this. Humans evolved to be grandparents, but historically, grandparents did not retire in the modern sense. They did not step away from physical life. They worked, they gathered food, they farmed, they hunted, they cared for grandchildren. They remained active because their role required it. And that activity was not just cultural, it was biological maintenance. Movement activates repair systems. It supports muscle preservation. It helps maintain mitochondrial function. It reduces the accumulation of cellular damage. It supports brain health. It lowers the risk of cognitive decline. Across nearly every major system in the body, physical activity slows deterioration. So when movement disappears, aging appears to speed up. But it's not that exercise stops time. It's that inactivity removes the mechanisms that help the body manage time. And when those mechanisms quiet down, decline becomes more visible. Aging continues either way. The difference is whether the body is actively resisting it or simply letting it unfold unchecked. A simple phrase appeared in a book about the human body: use it or lose it. The idea was straightforward. We evolved to use our bodies, and when we stop using them, they begin to decline. Recently, a question came up: why does it sometimes seem that when people retire, or when their longtime partner passes away, they don't live much longer afterward? There's almost a kind of folklore around it, that once you retire, your days are numbered. Is there an evolutionary reason for that? Part of the answer may be depression. When someone loses a partner, the grief is not just emotional. Cortisol levels rise, the immune system weakens, psychosocial stress takes a real physiological toll on the body. But there's something else happening too. When people retire, they often become less active, and that loss of activity affects nearly every system in the body, not just muscles and bones. The brain as well. Physical activity isn't only important for physical health, it's vital for mental health. Many modern issues, depression, anxiety, may partly stem from the simple fact that we move less than we evolved to, and as we age, becoming less physically active makes us even more vulnerable to disease. So, should we not retire? Retirement itself is a very modern concept. For most of human history, people didn't retire. Farmers worked their fields as long as they physically could. Hunter-gatherers remained active until illness or age made it impossible. The idea that you reach a certain birthday and simply stop working, that's new. And yes, there may be a cost to that. But retirement doesn't have to mean inactivity. Work can be replaced with other challenging, meaningful, rewarding activities. The key is simple: don't stop moving. One of the most fascinating long-term studies on this was conducted by Ralph Paffenbarger at Harvard University. Private universities keep close contact with their alumni for decades. That made them ideal for studying aging. Alumni were followed for 25 to 30 years. Researchers tracked their physical activity, diet, smoking habits, and ultimately, their health outcomes. What they found was striking. In people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, those who exercised 4 or 5 times a week had about a 20% lower death rate. But by the time participants reached their 60s and 70s, those who exercised more had roughly a 50% lower death rate. In other words, as you get older, exercise becomes more important, not less. And this finding has been replicated many times since. We evolved to use our bodies. And the older we get, the more that truth matters. It becomes real in moments like this. A man in his early 60s, severely out of shape, on a trip to Indonesia. There was a long descent, hundreds of steep steps carved into a hillside. At the bottom waited something joyful, white water rafting, an experience shared with someone loved, and a quiet thought surfaced. At 60, some people would not be able to make that walk. Not because of age alone, but because of conditioning. The unsettling part is how close that age really is. In the scale of a lifetime, it isn't far away. To imagine reaching a point where stairs become a barrier, where simple movement limits experience, can feel deeply sad. It's easy to blame genetics, to assume that decline is written into the body from birth. But biology offers a more nuanced view. There's a saying in medicine, genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. Some people carry higher genetic risk for diabetes, or heart disease, or dementia, but generations before us, living in different environments, experienced these conditions far less frequently. Not because they all died young, but because their daily lives demanded movement. We often overestimate the power of genetics and underestimate the power of the environment. Genetics matter, but the environment matters more, and the environment is not fixed. If the goal is to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes or Alzheimer's, exercise is not a miracle cure. It will not eliminate risk entirely, but it reduces risk substantially. And the evidence is overwhelming. Epidemiological data, mechanistic data, biological pathways, clearly mapped. We understand how physical activity improves insulin sensitivity, supports vascular health, reduces inflammation, and protects brain tissue. The science is not vague. The real challenge is not knowledge. It is instinct. Humans evolved to conserve energy. When given the choice between effort and ease, ease wins. In an airport, escalators sit beside empty staircases. Most people line up for the escalator. The stairs remain untouched. There is nothing morally wrong with that choice. It is normal. The instinct to take it easy once protected survival. In a world of scarcity, conserving energy was intelligent. But modern life has removed scarcity of effort. Cars, elevators, escalators, shopping carts, remote controls. Every system is designed to reduce movement. Now, staying active requires overriding a deeply embedded instinct. And if someone is already unfit, exercise feels unpleasant. It is uncomfortable, hot, strenuous, unsatisfying at first. Only after adaptation does it begin to feel rewarding. So when people struggle to exercise, it is not necessarily laziness. It is biology meeting modern convenience. Perhaps what's needed is not judgment, but understanding, and maybe a deliberate decision to choose the stairs while they are still possible. Are humans evolved to be lazy? Not exactly. But we are evolved to rest whenever possible. Energy conservation was once a survival strategy. If effort was not required, saving strength made sense. Today, that instinct remains. But the environment has changed. Modern life optimizes for convenience. Everything is designed to make effort optional, and comfort sells. Nobody prefers an uncomfortable seat over a comfortable one. Nobody chooses painful shoes on purpose. Comfort feels good. But since when does comfort automatically mean better? Are cushioned shoes healthier than walking barefoot? Is sitting all day in a soft chair better than standing? Is taking the elevator better than taking the stairs? In the short term, comfort wins. The benefit is immediate. The cost is delayed. We are wired to favor immediate rewards over distant consequences. Behavioral economists call this hyperbolic discounting. The present feels real. The future feels abstract. So we pay for convenience. We upgrade for comfort. We design our lives to minimize effort. And now we live in a world where physical activity is no longer necessary. For most of human history, movement was unavoidable. You moved because survival demanded it. Today, survival requires almost no movement at all. So if activity is no longer necessary, it must become intentional. Humans evolved to be physically active for two reasons: because it was necessary, and because over time it became rewarding. Remove necessity, and reward alone is not always enough, especially in the beginning, when movement feels uncomfortable. That is the challenge, not a weakness, not laziness. But biology meeting abundance, and learning to choose effort in a world built for ease. One way to make effort rewarding is to focus on the carrot: energy, mobility, longevity. But there is also the stick: Alzheimer's, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, cancer. Somewhere along the way, many of us began to treat these as inevitable, as if aging automatically produces illness. We live with the quiet assumption that if we survive long enough, something serious will eventually appear, and so we prepare not to prevent, but to treat. In many medical schools today, students are taught that blood pressure naturally rises with age, but that is not universally true. It rises in sedentary, industrialized populations, eating poor diets and living low-movement lives. There are populations and individuals who age without developing hypertension. What we've done is confuse correlation with causation. These diseases are more common with age, but age itself is not the root cause. Because we no longer die from infections in our 30s, we now live long enough to develop chronic diseases in our 60s. That is progress. But it has led to a dangerous assumption: that chronic disease is simply what aging looks like. It isn't inevitable, and the structure of our healthcare systems reflects that confusion. In the United States, often described as one of the most expensive and among the least efficient healthcare systems in the industrialized Western world, only about 3% of the medical budget is spent on prevention. 3%. Yet, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, roughly 75% of the diseases treated in doctors' offices are preventable. So, the majority of illness overwhelming the system is, in principle, avoidable, and yet almost none of the spending is directed toward preventing it. We invest heavily in treatment, very little in prevention. It is a structurally backward system, not because medicine is ineffective, modern medicine is extraordinary, but because the incentives are misaligned. The encouraging truth is this: preventing many chronic diseases is not mysterious. It requires physical activity, reasonable nutrition, education, access. Exercise is not a magic bullet. It will not eliminate risk entirely, but it substantially reduces the likelihood of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cognitive decline. The data is overwhelming. Epidemiological evidence, mechanistic research, long-term population studies. The barrier is not knowledge, it is behavior, and behavior is shaped by the environment. That makes the situation paradoxical. On one hand, it is deeply frustrating. Much suffering is preventable. On the other hand, it is hopeful. Because even without wealth, even without perfection, small, consistent choices meaningfully shift long-term outcomes. Not fate, not genetics alone, but probabilities. And over decades, probabilities determine lives. For many people, understanding the mechanism changes everything. When exercise is connected to insulin, to inflammation, to cancer risk, it stops feeling cosmetic. It becomes biological. If health had to be reduced to a short list, it might look like this: don't smoke, move regularly, reduce high-sugar, low-fiber foods. That's not revolutionary advice. But the reason behind it is powerful. Foods high in sugar, especially high glycemic foods, cause blood glucose to rise quickly. When glucose rises, insulin rises. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. Its primary job is to store energy. It signals cells to absorb glucose, to store fat, to build tissue. In simple terms, insulin helps move energy into cells. That's useful. But chronically elevated insulin changes the environment of the body. When cells are constantly flooded with energy, they are more prone to dysfunction. Excess energy, especially stored as fat, creates another problem. Fat cells begin to swell. When they swell beyond capacity, they become stressed, damaged. That damage activates the immune system. And when the immune system remains chronically activated, inflammation rises. Inflammation is not always bad. It protects us from infection. It repairs injury. But chronic, low-grade, systemic inflammation is different. It is like a slow burn inside the body. Over time, it contributes to cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, neurodegeneration, and even cancer progression. So there are two ways to manage inflammation. First, reduce what drives it. Limit foods that spike blood sugar dramatically. Avoid highly processed carbohydrates. Avoid trans fats. But there is a second lever, and many people overlook it. You can also actively turn inflammation down, and one of the most powerful tools for doing that is exercise. Muscle is not just mechanical tissue, it is an endocrine organ. When muscles contract, they release signaling molecules called myokines. One of them is interleukin-6, often abbreviated as IL-6. At low chronic levels, IL-6 can be pro-inflammatory. But during acute exercise, when produced in large bursts by active muscle, it has an anti-inflammatory effect. It helps regulate and suppress systemic inflammation. Because roughly a third of the human body is muscle, a long run, a swim, a bike ride activates an enormous endocrine response. Physically active individuals, even those who are overweight, often regulate inflammation better than sedentary individuals. And here is something important. Humans did not evolve alternative systems to manage chronic inflammation caused by inactivity. For most of evolutionary history, people were physically active by necessity. Inactivity was rare, usually associated with severe illness. So the primary regulatory mechanism for inflammation was movement itself. Modern sedentary life removed the necessity for movement. But biology never adapted to compensate, which means the system still expects muscle contraction as part of its regulatory design, and without it, the slow burn continues. We did not evolve in a world saturated with sugar. Never in human history has sugar been this abundant, this cheap, this embedded into nearly every processed food. In fact, today you often pay more for food with less added sugar. That alone says something. Humans are wired to crave sweetness. That preference is ancient. Among hunter-gatherer societies, honey is intensely valued. When a hunt fails, the focus can quickly shift. What begins as a hunting expedition becomes a honey-collecting expedition. Hive after hive is located. Smoke is used to drive out the bees, and enormous quantities of honey are consumed, far more than most modern people could imagine eating in one sitting. But there is a crucial difference. These are lean, physically active individuals. They may walk 15 kilometers in a day, 2 to 3 hours of movement, sometimes running. Their bodies are metabolically prepared to handle large bursts of sugar. The glucose is used, the insulin response is brief, the energy is burned. In that context, honey is not catastrophic. It is fuel. But modern life separates sugar from movement. We kept the sweetness, we removed the effort, and that changes the equation entirely. It's tempting to conclude that the solution is to live exactly like a hunter-gatherer. Walk 15 kilometers a day, run daily, replicate the Paleolithic lifestyle. But that's not necessary. Health does not require reenacting prehistory. Physical activity works on a curve. If you imagine plotting exercise on one axis and disease risk on the other, the first increments of activity produce the largest gains. Going from no movement to some movement dramatically lowers risk. Just a few minutes a day begins to shift outcomes. Over time, the curve flattens. The benefits continue, but they level off well before reaching hunter-gatherer levels of activity. You do not need to move like a forager to receive protection. Any activity is better than none. The body responds quickly to even modest signals. The real problem is not that we fail to reach ancestral extremes. It's that we often fall below the minimum threshold our biology expects. We evolved in motion. Not endlessly, not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency, more than intensity, is what reshapes the risk curve. If we could redesign the modern world from scratch, if we had a blank canvas, what would we change? It's a difficult question, because in many ways, the world we live in is the world we asked for. Unprecedented convenience, endless choice, comfort at every level. Today, a person can walk into a supermarket and access foods once reserved for royalty, cuisines from every culture, ingredients from every continent. In many cities, one can live an entire day without climbing a single staircase. Elevators, escalators, delivery services, on-demand everything. We built a world optimized for ease, and yet that optimization carries consequences. The things we crave, sugar, comfort, convenience, often conflict with long-term health. So any redesign must confront a tension. How do you improve public health without overriding personal freedom? Banning elevators would likely make people fitter. Banning highly refined sugar would likely reduce disease. But removing choice is neither realistic nor desirable. The answer is not prohibition, it is alignment. If the goal is to improve health and happiness, the first shift would not be control, but nudging. Instead of banning sugar, tax it more heavily. Instead of restricting unhealthy food, make healthy food equally affordable or cheaper. Instead of saturating the media with advertisements for ultra-processed snacks, promote whole foods with the same intensity. When was the last time anyone saw an advertisement celebrating how beneficial vegetables are? We aggressively market what harms us. We rarely market what protects us. Another shift would be cultural. Every human society likes dances. Dancing is movement. It is social. It is joyful. Why not make public movement a communal norm? Why not sponsor regular social physical activities in every town? Movement does not have to feel like punishment. It can feel like participation. A redesign would also require restructuring medicine. Medical education focuses overwhelmingly on treatment, far less on prevention. Doctors receive minimal training in nutrition, minimal training in exercise science. Healthcare systems are funded to manage disease after it appears not to prevent it beforehand. Public health institutions often operate at the margins, while acute treatment absorbs the majority of funding. Reversing that imbalance would have enormous long-term impact, not by eliminating freedom, not by eliminating comfort, but by reshaping incentives, making the healthier choice the easier choice, making movement rewarding and accessible, making prevention visible and valued. We cannot return to a pre-modern world, nor should we want to, but we can acknowledge that convenience without friction has side effects. And perhaps the real redesign is not about removing comfort, but about restoring just enough friction to keep our biology aligned with the world we've built. For most of human history, no one needed custom insoles, and yet today, millions of people do. Take something as common as plantar fasciitis, a sharp, stubborn pain along the bottom of the foot. It often starts subtly, a little discomfort, a little tightness. Then suddenly, every step reminds you something isn't right. You go to a specialist. They run scans, measure your feet, analyze your posture, and the conclusion is simple. Your arch is too flat. You're standing wrong. The solution? Custom insoles. Wear them in every pair of shoes. And that's when a deeper question appears. Where did we go wrong? How does someone in their 30s suddenly need artificial support just to walk comfortably? Our ancestors didn't have arch inserts. They didn't scan their feet, so why do we? The answer lies in something called a mismatch disease. A mismatch disease happens when our bodies designed for one environment are forced to live in another, and the modern world is very different from the one we evolved in. In the case of plantar fasciitis, the real issue often isn't the arch itself, it's a weakness. Most people strengthen nearly every muscle group in their body: chest, back, arms, legs, core. But almost no one trains their feet. And yet the foot is remarkably complex. It contains 4 layers of muscles that help support the arch. Beneath those layers lies a thick band of connective tissue called the plantar fascia. This tissue helps maintain the structural integrity of the foot. When the muscles are weak, the arch collapses more than it should. That overstretches the plantar fascia, and when it stretches too much, it becomes inflamed. Here's the real problem. The plantar fascia has very little blood supply. That means once it's irritated, it heals slowly, very slowly. Modern shoes make this worse. Stiff soles, thick cushioning, built-in arch supports. They feel comfortable, but they reduce the amount of work your foot muscles have to do. Over time, those muscles weaken even more. The foot becomes dependent on artificial support. So when pain shows up, what's the standard treatment? Add more support. Insoles prevent the arch from collapsing. They reduce strain on the plantar fascia. They ease the pain. And in the short term, that relief matters. Pain isn't trivial, but when we only treat the symptom without addressing the underlying weakness, something else happens. The foot becomes even more reliant on external support. The root cause remains untouched. This pattern has a name: dis-evolution. It's what happens when we solve modern problems in ways that move us further from our biological design instead of closer to it. There's nothing wrong with reducing pain. If insoles help, use them. But they shouldn't be the entire strategy. The long-term solution is simple, even if it requires effort. Strengthen the foot. A strong foot is a healthy foot. When the muscles regain their strength, the arch stabilizes naturally. The plantar fascia stops being overstretched. Inflammation decreases, and in many cases, the pain fades and doesn't return. The body was built to support itself. Sometimes, the real fix isn't adding more support. It's rebuilding the strength we slowly stopped using. The pain eventually fades. After about a month of wearing insoles, the inflammation settles down. The sharp discomfort disappears. Running is paused. Activity is reduced. And for the first time in weeks, walking feels normal again. Now comes the real opportunity: prevention. If the pain was caused by weakness, then the logical question becomes, how do you strengthen a foot? There are specific exercises designed for exactly that. Small, controlled movements, sometimes called foot doming exercises. They train the muscles that support the arch. They look simple, almost unimpressive. But done consistently, they rebuild strength, where it's usually neglected. That's one path. The other path is even more fundamental. Change what's on your feet. Most modern shoes are stiff. Thick soles, built-in arch support, cushioning everywhere. They feel protective, but they also prevent the foot from doing its natural job. Minimal shoes, flexible soles, no artificial arch support shift the workload back where it belongs, on your muscles. Even better is spending more time barefoot whenever it's safe to do so. Because here's what happens when you remove support. Your foot has to work again. Think about walking or running on sand. After a long walk on the beach, your feet feel tired, not injured, not inflamed, just tired. That fatigue tells you something important. Sand is a compliant surface. It moves beneath you. It isn't rigid like pavement. To stay stable and push yourself forward, your foot muscles have to engage more. They have to stiffen the foot dynamically with every step. That's strengthening in action. The goal isn't to suffer. It's to gradually reintroduce the kind of demand your feet were designed for, because when muscles are allowed to do their job consistently, they adapt. And when they adapt, the need for artificial support often begins to fade. Few topics trigger stronger reactions than this one. Running is bad for your knees. It's repeated constantly, even by doctors. And for many people, it becomes the perfect excuse to avoid running altogether. It's true that knee injuries are among the most common running injuries, but that statistic often gets confused with something much bigger: arthritis. Arthritis happens when cartilage in a joint gradually wears away. And despite the popular belief, running does not increase rates of knee cartilage damage or arthritis. That's not speculation. It's been studied extensively. If someone already has arthritis, running can be excruciating. In that case, it's absolutely problematic. But in people without arthritis, running is not destructive. If anything, it may even be slightly protective, because cartilage, like most tissues in the body, benefits from use. For years, we assumed joints worked like car tires. The more you use them, the faster they wear down. But the human body isn't a machine in that way. Physical activity stimulates repair mechanisms inside cartilage. Movement encourages maintenance. It strengthens rather than erodes. The real issue often isn't running itself, it's how we run. Humans have been running for millions of years. For most of that time, we did it barefoot. That raises an obvious question. How did people run before cushioned shoes? Modern running shoes typically have thick, cushioned heels. They allow people to run the way they walk, landing directly on the heel. This is called heel striking. But when people run barefoot, something interesting happens. Most don't land heavily on their heels. Instead, they land more toward the ball of the foot, then gently lower the heel. This is known as a forefoot strike or midfoot strike. Biomechanical research has shown that this style of running reduces what's called an impact peak, a sharp collisional force that occurs when the heel crashes into the ground. Instead of slamming into the pavement, the runner lands more lightly and smoothly. If you took off your shoes and tried running down a city street, you would feel this immediately. Within a few steps, you'd likely stop landing on your heels, not because someone told you to, but because it hurts less. That lighter landing reduces force transmitted through the knee. And since knees are the most commonly injured joint in runners, this matters. But nothing comes without trade-offs. Shifting to a forefoot strike places more demand on the ankles, calf muscles, and Achilles tendon. Those structures now have to work harder to control the lowering of the heel. If someone switches abruptly, without preparation, problems can appear quickly. Achilles tendon pain, calf strains, foot injuries. You can't simply decide to become a barefoot runner overnight. The transition must be gradual. Strength has to be built slowly. Technique has to be learned properly. Another common mistake is running too high on the toes, almost like a ballerina. That puts excessive strain on the calves and ankles. Proper forefoot running isn't tiptoeing. It's controlled, balanced, and efficient. When done correctly, however, this style of running can significantly reduce stress on the knees, which reframes the original claim. It's not that running is bad for your knees. It's that modern habits, modern shoes, modern technique, sudden transitions may be the real problem. The human body evolved to run. But like everything else, it works best when we understand how it was designed to move. So should you run barefoot? Not necessarily. What matters most isn't what's on your feet, it's how you run. A barefoot-style technique can be beneficial, but simply removing your shoes isn't the solution. The real shift is mechanical. The first question is simple. How are you running right now? Some people already run efficiently without realizing it. But, in general, an effective running style tends to include a higher stride rate, roughly 170 to 180 steps per minute, about 90 strides per minute per leg. That quicker rhythm naturally shortens your stride, and shorter strides matter. One of the biggest mistakes runners make is overstriding. Overstriding happens when you throw your leg too far out in front of your body and land with a stiff leg. A stiff leg creates more force. More force means more stress, especially on the knees. Almost every running coach agrees on this. Overstriding is inefficient and increases injury risk. A well-aligned stride looks different. When your foot lands, your lower leg, the tibia, should be nearly vertical. Your ankle should land roughly beneath your knee, not far out in front of it. In that position, the leg functions like a spring. You reduce braking force, you reduce impact, you reduce strain. And when that alignment is right, many other things fall into place automatically. You're less likely to slam into your heel. Your body absorbs force more smoothly. The motion becomes lighter and more elastic. Instead of obsessing over whether you're landing on your heel or forefoot, focus on one thing first. Stop overstriding. Fix that, and your mechanics often improve naturally. The skill of running well isn't about forcing yourself into an extreme style. It's about moving in a way that allows your body to act like it was designed to, efficient, spring-like, and controlled. What's the best kind of cardiovascular exercise for good health? It's a question almost everyone asks at some point. Should you run? Do high-intensity interval training? CrossFit? Long, slow cardio? Something else entirely? There's a temptation to believe there's one superior method, one perfect formula, the ultimate workout that outperforms everything else. But the truth is simpler. The best exercise is the one you'll actually keep doing. Consistency matters more than perfection. That said, variety matters too. The human body didn't evolve to specialize in just one repetitive movement. It evolved to handle a wide range of physical demands, walking long distances, sprinting occasionally, lifting, carrying, climbing. Our physiology is complex. It responds best to mixed inputs. Cardio forms the foundation. It delivers enormous health benefits. It improves cardiovascular function, helps regulate inflammation, supports metabolic health, burns energy efficiently, protects against chronic disease. In many ways, it's the bedrock of physical activity. But cardio itself isn't one thing. There's low-intensity, steady movement, and there's high-intensity effort. Both stress the body differently. Both produce different adaptations. Then there's strength training. Muscle mass isn't just about aesthetics. It plays a major role in metabolic health, resilience, aging, and injury prevention. Ignoring it leaves part of the system underdeveloped. So what's the correct dose? That's where things get complicated. We often try to medicalize exercise, as if it were a pill. Take this many minutes, this many times per week, at this exact intensity. But the body doesn't work like that. There is no universal optimal prescription. The right balance depends on context. Are you more concerned about heart disease, diabetes, cognitive decline, depression? Are you recovering from injury? Are you already fit? Just starting? Aging? Sedentary? The answer shifts depending on the individual. That's why mixing it up tends to be the most reliable strategy. Some low, steady movement, some higher intensity work, some strength training, enough recovery to adapt, not because it's trendy, but because the body was built for diversity of movement, not specialization in a single mode. Health isn't built from one perfect exercise. It's built from varied, repeated, sustainable effort over time.